I was asked to substitute for him, and there's really no substitute for him. But he was, in the words of his colleagues, the greatest foreign correspondent in his generation. I've never seen so many of his prominent colleagues in the journalism profession step forward and say such wonderful things about him, both personally and professionally. Usually prominent double Pulitzer Prize winners, and he's going to get a third next month, the first journalist ever to get 3 at age 43. Usually they're very competitive, and they have robust egos. Some of them are quite arrogant. But it was the outpouring of memorial gatherings at the New York Times and the Washington Post where he worked. People like his editor at the Boston Globe said that he changed the way we look at the Middle East with his reporting. Another colleague said there's no one to replace him. Someone else said that working with him in Baghdad under horrendous conditions was like working with a world-famous violin virtuoso or a superstar athlete. The question when I read all this is why were they so laudatory? And they were laudatory not just because of his lyrical reports from the streets of the Middle East, his ability to speak fluent Arabic, his ability to put his reports in historical context. That's very rare today. His ability to elicit from ordinary people what it was like to be bombed and blown up and evicted from their homes and neighborhoods. And it was more than that. It was his personality. And I spoke to him a number of times in recent years. I knew his family back in Oklahoma, where he was raised. And his family was really quite prominent. One of his great uncles started the first farmer-owned cooperative hospital in America in 1929. He graduated from Washington University Medical School, and he could have had a posh medical practice, but he headed for Southwest Oklahoma, or dirt poor farmers. And he organized them to build and own their own hospital. And he went all over the country supporting the idea of prepaid health care. So he was really the precursor for Kaiser Permanente, the prepaid health care systems we have today. That was his great uncle. But it was his personal traits. To a person, they all said he was very humble. And that's why he learned. The humility was his way of learning. If he was arrogant, it closed most of his mind, even though he was a world-acclaimed journalist. And they talked about his generosity. Well, he always helped other journalists when other journalists were fairly competitive. When they got in hot water because they couldn't speak Arabic with the police or with a government official, he would be there. And the New York Times flew him to Libya during the tumult in Libya, and he was captured with 3 other journalists and for a week and beaten. He didn't have to go there. He went there to help his fellow journalists. He was based in Beirut, the bureau chief there. And they talk about his kindness, and his kindness was another feature of his greatness. He finished, fortunately, restoring his ancestral home in a little village in southern Lebanon, Marjayoun. It was built by his great-grandfather in 1928, and it was reduced to rubble in one of the Israeli invasions. And he rebuilt it with him being there day after day with the artisans, and then just wrote the book that just came out, House of Stone, which has been very widely praised. And I think you would like very much to read it. That was his last book. And the sad part of it is, instead of being here this evening, his ashes are in the garden in back of his ancestral home. And he left a wife and 2 children, a 9-year-old girl and a 2-year-old boy, who will never know his father. So it happened because of a unique combination of circumstances. He had asthma. He went into a dangerous area in Syria with horses, surrounded by dogs, extremely allergic to horses and dogs. And it was rugged mountains, and he was very dangerous. And he collapsed just before he was on his, he had reached the Turkish border. In other words, he'd finished his week's work, ready to write articles for the Times, and he collapsed. That after you describe Congress, which spends 22% of your income, can send your children off to war, can raise your taxes, can expose you to toxic materials of polluters, it can do a lot of things, you know, good or bad, for your state of living. How many people you know spend as much time watching Congress as they do watching themselves in the mirror? That's a tough question to answer. If you had a neighbor that spent 22% of your income, could send your children off to war, could turn their back on a polluter that made your kids sick with emphysema and so forth, I mean, would you spend some time? Well, that's your member of Congress. So I suppose it starts for the teachers here in our schooling system. Our schooling system are heavily memorization, regurgitation to vegetation. They are not the kind of schools that prepare the children for civic roles, the most important roles they'll ever have. I mean, they can be good doctors and engineers and chemists and plumbers and electricians, but they all have to be civically engaged. If we're going to take the values of the people, if we're going to take the central directions that we want our country to go into in the future and around the world, seriously. And there isn't anybody who can't make a contribution here. There's no ticket of admission to being an active citizen. I'm semi-horrified when I ask, you know, a lot of students come to Washington, and I'm sometimes asked to speak with them. And I say, how many of you have never been in a mall, McDonald's or Walmart? And like, nobody raises their hand. I mean, if one time one person raised her hand, she'd just come in from Finland. And then I say, okay, let's switch the scene. How many of you have never been in a court of law as a spectator? Hands go up. How many of you have never been at a city council or a town council meeting? Hands go up. How many of you have never been visited a prison to see what it's like to be a country that has the highest percent of prisoners per capita in the entire world, including solitary confinement? Hands go up. So they're in the commercial arena because they want to buy things or eat things. They're not in the governmental, public arena. That's where it starts.